Captain Diana Frost had been in plenty of dangerous situations during her career with the Terran Defense Force, but walking into the throne room of an alien queen with 3 dragons staring at her made every other mission seem easy by comparison. The silver dragon was the largest, and it coiled around a massive pillar near the throne, with scales that caught the light and threw it back in 1,000 different directions, and its eyes followed Diana with an intelligence that made her skin crawl. Because this was not just an animal, 2 smaller dragons flanked the doorway, and their copper scales gleamed like polished metal, and they made a low rumbling sound in their chests that Diana felt more than heard. The throne room itself was massive, with windows that stretched from floor to ceiling and showed the alien sky outside, with its 3 moons already visible. Even though it was still afternoon, and the walls were covered in carvings that seemed to move when Diana was not looking directly at them, Queen Valara stood beside her throne, and she was tall, even for an elf, with skin so pale it was almost luminescent, and hair that fell past her waist in a cascade of silver white, and her eyes were violet, which Diana had learned was a sign of royal blood among the Sylvan people, Your Majesty, Diana said, and bowed her head, the way the protocol officer had drilled into her during the 3-day journey to the Sylvan homeworld. The queen studied her for a long moment, and then gestured for Diana to approach, and her movements were fluid and graceful in a way that made Diana feel clumsy and awkward. In her military uniform, Captain Frost, Queen Valara said, and her voice had that musical quality all the high elves possessed, and it carried easily across the vast room. And we have heard much about you. Diana was not sure if that was good or bad, because she had fought against Sylvan forces in the border conflicts, and she had killed elven soldiers and destroyed their ships, and now she was standing in the heart of their empire with no weapons and no backup. The queen seemed to read her thoughts, because she smiled slightly and said, "You need not fear for your safety here, and we requested you specifically because of your reputation for honor." That made Diana relax a fraction, because honor was something the Sylvan people valued above almost everything else. And if the queen was talking about honor, then Diana was probably not about to be executed. "There is someone we would like you to meet," Queen Valara continued, and she turned toward a doorway hidden behind a tapestry. A girl emerged from the shadows, and Diana felt her breath catch, because the girl looked maybe 16 or 17 with the pointed ears and elegant features of the Sylvan people. But there was something different about her face, something that made Diana look twice. The girl wore a simple dress in shades of green and blue, and her hair was dark brown instead of the silver or gold that most elves had, and her eyes were violet. But Diana suspected those might be contacts, because they seemed to sit oddly on her face. The 2 copper dragons moved immediately to flank the girl, and they pressed against her sides like devoted pets, and the girl reached down to stroke their heads without looking at them, as if this was something she did 1,000 times a day. "This is my daughter," Queen Valara said, and her voice carried a weight that made Diana understand this was important. "And Princess Kayla." Diana bowed again, because you always bowed to royalty, especially when that royalty had dragons, and said, "It is an honor to meet you, Your Highness." The girl Kayla smiled, and it transformed her face and made her look younger and more vulnerable, and she said, "The honor is mine, Captain Frost, and I have wanted to meet you for a very long time." That was odd, because Diana had never heard of Princess Kayla before this mission, and she had certainly never done anything that would bring her to the attention of the Sylvan royal family. Queen Valara moved closer and placed one pale hand on her daughter's shoulder and said, "Captain Frost, we have brought you here for a reason, and that reason is standing before you." Diana waited, because she had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the best response when dealing with aliens who liked to be dramatic. Kayla took a step forward, and the dragons moved with her in perfect synchronization. And she said, "Captain Frost, do you know anything about the colony, Ship Horizon?" The question hit Diana like a punch to the gut, and suddenly the throne room felt too hot and too small, and her vision tunneled down to just the girl's face. The Horizon had been Diana's first assignment fresh out of the academy, and she had been just a junior officer back then, responsible for helping maintain the ship's systems during their journey to establish a new colony. But the Horizon never made it to its destination, because pirates had attacked them in deep space, and the captain had ordered an evacuation, and they had loaded everyone they could into escape pods and sent them scattering toward any habitable world within range. Diana had survived because she had been in the command section, but most of the colonists had not been so lucky. And the worst part was the children, because they had put all the youngest children into pods together with emergency beacons and supplies, and sent them away hoping that anyone would find them. Her little sister Katie had been in one of those pods, and she had been only 2 years old, and Diana had watched her pod disappear into the black and had never known if she survived. "Yes," Diana said, and her voice came out rough. "And I know about the horizon." Kayla's violet eyes were locked on Diana's face, and she said, "I came to this world 17 years ago in a metal pod that fell from the sky and crashed in the forest near the capital." Diana felt the world tilt, and she reached out to steady herself against a pillar, and the silver dragon hissed but did not move. Queen Valara continued the story and said, "We found her in the wreckage barely alive, and we brought her to the palace, and our healers saved her life. And when she recovered, we discovered she was human. We had no way to contact your people," the queen said, and her expression was carefully neutral, and the war had just begun. "And we feared if we returned her, she would be used as a hostage or worse. So you kept her," Diana said, and looked at Kayla with new eyes. "We raised her as our own," Queen Valara said, "and pulled her daughter close, and she has been loved and protected and trained in our ways. And 2 years ago she bonded with the dragons, which makes her one of only 7 dragon riders in the Empire." Diana stared at the girl who might be her sister, and tried to see past the violet contacts and the pointed ears and the elegant dress. "What was your name, Kayla?" Diana asked, and her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "And before they found you, what name was in your pod?" The girl smiled sadly and said, "The records in the pod were damaged, but there was a blanket with letters stitched into it, and the letters spelled Katie." Diana's legs gave out, and she sank to her knees on the polished floor, and the tears came before she could stop them, because Katie was alive, and she was standing right there, and she was alive. Queen Valara made a gesture, and the dragons backed away, and Kayla crossed the distance between them and knelt down beside Diana. "Are you really my sister?" Kayla asked, and her voice was small and uncertain. Diana looked up at her and saw Katie's nose and Katie's stubborn chin, and Katie's way of tilting her head when she was curious. "Yes," Diana whispered and reached out with shaking hands, "and I am, and I have thought you were dead for 15 years. Kayla threw her arms around Diana, and Diana held her baby sister and cried. Diana sat in a comfortable chair in a private room off the throne hall and held a cup of something warm that smelled like flowers and tasted like honey, and tried to process everything that had just happened. Kayla sat across from her with the 2 copper dragons curled at her feet, and she kept staring at Diana like she was afraid she might disappear if she looked away. Queen Valara stood by the window with her hands clasped behind her back and watched the alien sun set over her capital city, and the silver dragon had followed them into the room and now lay along one entire wall like a living piece of furniture. "Tell me about her," Queen Valara said without turning around, "and tell me about the child she was before the horizon." Diana took a shaky breath and said, "Katie was the youngest of 3 children, and our parents were colonists looking for a fresh start, and she was only 2 when we boarded the ship, so she does not remember Earth." "What was she like?" the Queen asked. Diana smiled despite the tears still wet on her face and said, "She was fearless, and she loved anything that moved, and she would chase butterflies for hours, and she laughed all the time, and she had this stuffed bear that she carried everywhere." "Do you still have the bear?" Kayla asked, and leaned forward with hope written all over her face. Diana shook her head and said, "It was probably in your escape pod, and I am sorry." Kayla's face fell, and one of the copper dragons nudged her hand with its snout and made a soft chirping sound that seemed designed to comfort. "I do not remember any of it," Kayla said, and her voice was quiet, "and I do not remember Earth or the ship or my family, and my first memory is waking up in a bed in this palace with Queen Valara sitting beside me." "That is not uncommon," Queen Valara said, and finally turned from the window. "And trauma can erase memories, especially in young children. And we did not push you to remember, because we wanted you to heal." Diana looked at the alien queen and tried to reconcile what she knew about the Sylvan Empire with this woman who had clearly loved and raised a human child, and said, "Why did you do it, and why did you save her and raise her as your own queen?" Valara was silent for a long moment, and then she moved to sit in a chair beside Kayla and said, "Because I lost my own daughter 3 years before we found yours." Diana had not expected that, and she saw the pain flash across the queen's face before she could hide it. My daughter was killed in a raid by human pirates. The queen continued, and her voice was steady, but Diana could hear the grief underneath, and she was only 14, and she had just bonded with her first dragon. I am so sorry, Diana said, and meant it. Queen Valara nodded and said, when we found your sister injured and alone in that pod, I saw a chance to save one child when I could not save my own, and I know it was selfish, but I could not let her die. That is not selfish, Diana said. And that is compassion. The queen smiled slightly and said, my advisors thought I was mad, and they said keeping a human child during wartime was dangerous and foolish, but I did not care, and I raised her as I would have raised my own daughter, and she bonded with dragons, Kayla said with pride in her voice, and no human has ever done that before. Diana looked at the copper dragons and said, how is that even possible? And I thought dragon bonding was genetic. It is, Queen Valara said. We thought it was. But Kayla proved us wrong. And 2 years ago during the bonding ceremony, these two chose her, and it shocked everyone, including me. The dragons lifted their heads at the mention of their bonding, and their copper scales rippled with color. Kayla reached down and scratched one behind its ear ridges and said, their names are Spark and Ember, and they are siblings, and they were the smallest of their clutch. But they are fierce. Diana watched her sister interact with the dragons and saw how natural it was and how the creatures responded to her every movement, and she realized that Kayla was not just pretending to be Sylvan nobility, and she truly belonged here. What happens now? Diana asked, and looked between the queen and her sister. That depends on you. Queen Valara said, and we brought you here because Kayla has been asking questions about her past, and she deserves to know the truth about where she came from. But there is more to it than that, Diana said, because she was not stupid, and queens did not summon enemy soldiers just for family reunions. The queen inclined her head and said, you are correct, and there is more, and Kayla is not just my heir, and she is also the key to ending this war. Diana set down her cup because her hands had started shaking again, and said, explain. Queen Valara stood and began pacing and said, there is an old prophecy among my people, and it speaks of a child of two worlds who will bridge the gap between species and bring peace to the galaxy. And you think that is Kayla? Diana said. I know it is, the queen said, and stopped pacing and looked directly at Diana. And she is human by birth and Sylvan by upbringing, and she has bonded with dragons, which should be impossible, and she is the heir to my throne, which gives her political power. And most importantly, she is living proof that our two species can coexist. Diana saw where this was going and said, you want to use her as a symbol. I want to use her as a bridge. Queen Valara corrected, and this war has cost both our peoples too much, and millions are dead, and entire planets are ruins, and for what? And for resources, and for pride, and for old grudges. Diana could not argue with that because she had seen the cost of war firsthand. But for Kayla to be that bridge she needs, to be accepted by both our peoples, the queen continued, and she needs humanity to recognize her as legitimate, and she needs your government to see her as more than a traitor or a hostage. And that is where I come in. Diana said, yes. Queen Valara said, and you are a decorated officer, and you have a spotless service record, and you are her blood sister. And if you testify that the Sylvan Empire saved and raised a human child with love and honor, then perhaps your people will listen. Diana looked at Kayla and saw her sister watching her with desperate hope and said, and if I refuse, then I stay here. Kayla said before the queen could answer, and I stay on this world and remain the heir and eventually become queen, and the war continues. But if you help us, the queen said, and if you testify and if you convince your people that peace is possible through Kayla, then maybe we can stop the killing. Diana thought about all the soldiers she had lost and all the friends who would never go home, and all the families torn apart by this endless conflict. She thought about the horizon and the desperate choices they had made that night when the pirates attacked. She thought about Katie, the fearless little girl who chased butterflies and laughed all the time, and she looked at Kayla, who was that little girl grown up and alive against all odds and raised by an enemy queen with love and compassion. I will do it, Diana said, and her voice was firm. and I will testify and I will help you, and I will do everything in my power to make both our people see what I see." "And what do you see?" Queen Valara asked. Diana smiled through her tears and said, "I see my sister alive, and I see a chance for peace, and I see hope." The next 3 days passed in a blur of meetings and preparations, and Diana quickly learned that agreeing to help was the easy part, because actually convincing two warring governments to consider peace was going to be nearly impossible. Queen Valara had assigned Diana quarters in the palace near Kayla's rooms, and Diana woke each morning to the sound of dragons calling to each other from the towers and courtyards. On the second morning, Kayla knocked on Diana's door before dawn and said, "Come with me, and I want to show you something." Diana dressed quickly and followed her sister through the quiet palace halls and out into a massive courtyard where dozens of dragons were already stirring in the early light. The dragons came in all sizes and colors, and Diana saw green ones and blue ones and gold ones and even one that seemed to be made of living crystal, and they all watched Kayla with recognition as she walked past. "We are going to the Eyrie," Kayla explained, "and that is where the dragons live and where riders train." They climbed a long staircase carved into the side of the palace, and Diana's legs were burning by the time they reached the top. But the view was worth it, because she could see the entire capital spread out below, with its silver towers and green gardens and the 3 moons still visible in the lightening sky. Spark and Ember were waiting at the top, and they chirped excitedly when they saw Kayla and pressed their heads against her hands. "This is where I feel most at home," Kayla said, and gestured to the wide platform where several other dragons were perched. "And when I am here with the dragons, I do not have to think about politics or war or prophecies, and I can just be myself." Diana watched her sister move among the dragons with easy confidence and saw how they responded to her presence and said, "You really love them. They saved me," Kayla said, and stopped to stroke a massive green dragon's neck. "And when I first came here, I was so lost, and I did not speak the language, and I did not understand anything, and I had nightmares every night about the crash. But the dragons understood," Diana said. Kayla nodded and said, "Dragons do not care if you are human or elf, and they do not care about politics, and they just know if your heart is good. And when Spark and Ember chose me during the bonding ceremony, it was the first time I truly felt like I belonged somewhere." A tall elf woman approached them, and she had silver hair braided down her back and scars on her arms that looked like they came from dragon claws, and she bowed to Kayla and said, "Good morning, Your Highness." "Good morning, Lyra," Kayla said warmly. "And this is my sister, Captain Diana." Frost Lyra's eyes widened, and she studied Diana with open curiosity and said, "So the rumors are true and the human captain is your blood sister?" "Yes," Kayla said, and looked at Diana with affection. "And we are still getting to know each other, but I am glad she is here." Lyra bowed to Diana and said, "Any sister of Princess Kayla is welcome in the area, and if you wish I can show you how we trained the dragon riders." Diana accepted and spent the next hour watching elven riders work with their dragons, and it was like watching a dance because the riders and dragons moved together with perfect synchronization, and trust Kayla demonstrated with Spark and Ember, and she climbed onto Spark's back, and the dragon launched into the air with powerful strokes of its wings, and Ember followed, and they flew in complicated patterns above the Eyrie. Diana's heart was in her throat, watching her sister soar hundreds of feet in the air, with nothing but a dragon between her and the ground. But Kayla looked completely at ease and even happy. When they landed, Kayla was breathless and grinning and said, "Do you want to try?" Diana laughed and said, "I think I will keep my feet on the ground for now." That afternoon, Queen Valara summoned both of them to a private council chamber, and when they arrived, they found several high-ranking elves already seated around a long table. "These are my most trusted advisors," the queen said, "and they need to hear your testimony before we present it to your government." Diana stood before them and told the story of the horizon and the pirate attack and the desperate evacuation, and her voice shook when she described watching her baby sister's escape pod disappear into space. She told them about the 15 years of not knowing and the guilt of surviving when so many others did not, and the grief of believing Katie was dead. And then she told them about walking into the throne room 3 days ago and recognizing her sister despite the years and the violet contacts and the elven clothes, one of the advisors. A stern-looking elf with gold hair asked, "And you believe Princess Kayla should be recognized by humanity as a legitimate representative?" Diana met his gaze and said, "I believe my sister is living proof that our two species can coexist. And I believe she was raised with love and honor by Queen Valara, and I believe she represents our best chance for peace." Another advisor asked, "And what if your government rejects this? And what if they see her as a traitor or a collaborator? Then they are fools," Diana said bluntly. And because Kayla did not choose this and she was 2 years old when her pod crashed, and she has been raised as Sylvan, because that was the only option available to her, the advisors murmured among themselves, and Diana could not tell if they were impressed or offended by her directness. Queen Valara raised a hand for silence and said, "Captain Frost speaks with the honesty we value, and I believe her testimony will carry weight with the human government," one of the advisors said, "and if it does not, and if the humans reject this offer of peace, then we continue as we have been." The queen said, and her voice was sad, "And the war continues and more people die on both sides, and we will have tried and failed, but at least we will have tried." That evening, Diana found Kayla in the palace gardens, sitting beside a fountain with Spark and Ember sleeping nearby. "Can I join you?" Diana asked. "Please," Kayla said, and patted the bench beside her. They sat in comfortable silence while listening to the water and watching the stars come out in the alien sky. "Are you scared?" Diana asked. Terrified, Kayla admitted. "And what if your government says no? And what if they think I am a traitor? And what if this whole plan fails?" Diana took her sister's hand and said, "Then we deal with that when it happens, but right now we focus on doing everything we can to make this work." Kayla squeezed her hand and said, "I am glad you are here, and I know we just met again. But having you here makes me feel less alone." "You are not alone," Diana said. "And you have Queen Valara, who clearly loves you, and you have the dragons, and you have the entire Sylvan Empire supporting you. And now you have me too. Do you think our parents would be proud of me?" Kayla asked quietly. Diana felt tears prick her eyes and said, "They would be incredibly proud, and you survived impossible odds, and you learned to live in an alien culture, and you bonded with dragons, and you are trying to stop a war, and yes, they would be proud." Kayla wiped at her eyes and said, "I wish I could remember them." "Maybe someday you will," Diana said, "and trauma memories can come back but even if they do not, you should know that they loved you so much, and our mother used to sing to you every night, and our father would carry you on his shoulders, and they would be amazed by the woman you have become." "Thank you," Kayla whispered. They sat together until the moons rose, and Diana realized that no matter what happened with the peace negotiations, she had gotten her sister back, and that alone made the risk worth taking. The message from Terran Command arrived on the 5th day, and Diana read it 3 times before she fully processed what it said, because they were agreeing to a meeting, but under strict conditions and with multiple layers of security and suspicion. Queen Valara called an emergency council session, and Diana stood before the assembled advisors and translated the message into terms they would understand. "They are willing to listen," Diana said, but they want the meeting to take place on neutral ground, and they want independent witnesses, and they want assurances that this is not a trap. "Reasonable demands," one of the advisors said grudgingly. The Queen looked at Kayla and asked, "Are you ready for this?" Kayla sat straight in her chair with Spark and Ember flanking her throne and said, "I have to be ready, and this is what I was meant to do." Over the next week, preparations moved forward at a frantic pace, and Diana worked with both Sylvan officials and her own military contacts to arrange the details of the historic meeting. The neutral ground they chose was a small moon in an unclaimed system, and it had an old trading outpost that had been abandoned when the war started, and both sides agreed to bring minimal security and no heavy weapons. Diana spent hours coaching Kayla on human customs and speech patterns, because even though Kayla spoke perfect English, she had the formal cadence of Sylvan nobility, and Diana worried that would make her seem less authentic to the human delegation. "Try to relax your voice," Diana said during one practice session, "and humans speak more casually than elves, and we use contractions and shorter sentences." Kayla tried again and said, "I am glad to meet you," instead of "I am most pleased to make your acquaintance." "Better," Diana said encouragingly. They also worked on Kayla's appearance because the violet contacts and pointed ears would immediately mark her as Sylvan, and they needed the human delegation to see her as human first queen. Valara was reluctant to change anything and said she is who she is and we should not hide that. I agree, Diana said. But we need them to recognize her as human before they can accept her as both, and first impressions matter. In the end, they compromised. And Kayla would wear simple, human clothing but keep her violet contacts, and her hair would cover her ears without being obviously styled to do so. The dragons were another complicated issue because Spark and Ember refused to be separated from Kayla for more than a few hours. And Queen Valara said, "That is the bond, and the dragons will follow her anywhere, and we cannot change that." "Will the humans accept dragons at the meeting?" one advisor asked. "They will have to," Diana said. "And because the dragons are proof that Kayla is who we say she is. And no human has ever bonded with a dragon, and that makes her unique." The night before they were scheduled to leave for the neutral moon, Diana could not sleep, and she found Kayla in the eyrie with the dragons watching the stars. "Cannot sleep either?" Kayla asked when Diana approached. "Too much on my mind," Diana admitted and sat beside her sister. "What if they hate me?" Kayla said quietly. "And what if they look at me and only see a traitor?" Diana put an arm around her shoulders and said, "Then they are idiots, but I do not think that will happen, and I think when they see you and hear your story they will understand." Kayla leaned against her and said, "I keep having this dream where I walk into the meeting and everyone starts shouting and calling me names, and the dragons get scared and everything falls apart. That is just anxiety," Diana said. "And your mind playing tricks on you, and the real meeting will be different." "How do you know?" Kayla asked. "Because you are amazing," Diana said. "And you survived a crash that should have killed you. And you learned to live in a completely alien culture. And you bonded with creatures that were supposed to be impossible for humans to bond with. And you are offering both sides a path to peace, and anyone who cannot see how incredible that is does not deserve your worry." Kayla smiled and said, "You are good at the encouraging sister thing. I have had 15 years to practice in my head," Diana said. "And I used to imagine what I would say to you if I ever found you alive." "What did you imagine saying?" Kayla asked. Diana laughed and said, "Mostly, I imagined yelling at you for scaring me. But now that you are here, I just want to make sure you know how loved you are." "I do know," Kayla said, "and Queen Valara made sure of that, and she has been a wonderful mother to me." Diana felt a pang of something that might have been jealousy, but she pushed it down because she was grateful Kayla had been loved and raised well, and said, "I am glad she was there for you." "Do you think our real parents would be angry that I call her mother Kayla?" asked Diana. Shook her head and said, "No. And I think they would be grateful that you had someone who loved you. And family is not just about blood." The next morning, they boarded a Sylvan transport ship along with Queen Valara and a small security detail, and the journey to the neutral moon took 6 hours. Diana spent most of that time reviewing her testimony and trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Kayla spent the journey in meditation with the dragons, and she seemed calmer than Diana felt. When they arrived at the abandoned outpost, the human delegation was already there, and Diana recognized several faces, including Admiral Chen, who had been her commanding officer during the border conflicts, and Ambassador Rodriguez, who was famous for his negotiating skills. The two groups met in a large room that had probably been a cargo bay, and someone had set up chairs and tables and neutral. Lighting Admiral Chen looked at Diana with surprise and said, "Captain Frost, and we were not expecting you to be here," I requested her, Queen Valara said, and stepped forward with regal grace. "And she is Princess Kayla's sister." The human delegation erupted in shocked murmurs, and Ambassador Rodriguez held up a hand for silence and said, "Perhaps we should all sit down and hear the full story." They took their seats, and Diana noticed how the humans kept glancing at Spark and Ember, who had positioned themselves protectively near Kayla. Diana began the testimony, and she told them everything about the horizon and the evacuation and finding Kayla alive after 15 years. And she spoke clearly and honestly, and she held nothing back. When she finished, there was a long silence, and Admiral Chen finally said, "This is extraordinary, and if true, it changes everything." "It is true," Diana said, and I have verified every detail, and Kayla is my sister, and she was raised by Queen Valara with love and honor, and she represents our best chance for peace." Ambassador Rodriguez looked at Kayla and said, "Princess Kayla, and do you remember anything about being human?" Kayla spoke for the first time, and her voice was steady and said, "No, Ambassador, and my first memories are of waking in the Sylvan Palace, and I was raised as one of them because that was the only option, but I have always known I was different." And the dragons, one of the other delegates asked, "And how did a human bond with them? I do not fully understand it myself," Kayla said. But during the bonding ceremony, Spark and Ember chose me, and the bond is real and it is permanent, and they are as much a part of me as my own heart." One of the human military officers said, "And what is to stop the Sylvan Empire from using you as a puppet and from controlling you to manipulate humanity?" Queen Valara answered before Kayla could and said, "Because that would defeat the entire purpose, and we are offering peace through Kayla, not control, and she will be free to make her own choices and to represent both our peoples honestly." The meeting continued for hours, and the questions came from every direction, and Diana watched her sister handle each one with grace and intelligence. Finally, Ambassador Rodriguez said, "We need time to discuss this and to consult with our government, but I will say this is the most promising peace initiative we have seen in 30 years. That is all we ask." Queen Valara said, as the meeting broke up. Admiral Chen pulled Diana aside and said, "If this works and if we actually achieve peace, and you will go down in history." "I do not care about history," Diana said, "and I just want my sister to be safe, and I want the killing to stop." The Admiral nodded and said, "For what it is worth, I believe you and I believe her, and I will recommend we move forward." "Thank you, sir," Diana said. That night, back on the transport ship heading home, Kayla finally let herself cry, and Diana held her while she shook with relief and exhaustion. "We did it," Kayla whispered, "and we actually did it." "Not yet," Diana said, "but we made a good start, and now we wait and see if they follow through." "Whatever happens," Kayla said, "and I am glad you were there." Diana kissed her sister's forehead and said, "Always, and I will always be there for you." 3 months passed in a strange limbo where both governments debated and argued and sent endless messages back and forth, while Diana and Kayla waited to see if their testimony would matter. Diana had been given extended leave from active duty, and she spent most of her time on the Sylvan homeworld with her sister, and they made up for 15 lost years by talking for hours every day. Kayla taught Diana to understand dragon speech, which was not really speech but a complex series of sounds, and body language and emotional resonance that took weeks to begin comprehending. Diana taught Kayla about human culture, and showed her pictures of Earth and their family, and told her stories about their parents and their older brother who had died in the evacuation. Some days were harder than others, and Kayla had nightmares about the crash, and Diana had guilt about not being able to save her, and they worked through it together with patience and love. Queen Valara watched their growing bond with approval, and she told Diana one evening, "You have given her something I could not, and you have given her roots and a connection to where she came from. You gave her everything," Diana said, "and you gave her life and love and purpose, and I'm grateful. We both love her," the Queen said, "and that is what matters." The political situation grew more tense as hardliners on both sides opposed the peace initiative, and there were protests on human worlds and heated debates in the Sylvan Council chambers. Someone tried to assassinate Kayla in the 4th month, and a radical elf who believed humans were inferior planted a bomb in the airy spark, sensed the danger before it exploded, and grabbed Kayla with his claws and flew her to safety while Ember used his body to shield other dragons from the blast. Both dragons survived, but Ember had burns across his side, and Kayla spent 3 days in the medical wing refusing to leave his side while the healers worked. Diana sat with her sister and watched her sister cry into Ember's scales and whisper promises that she would keep him safe. When Ember finally recovered enough to move, Kayla looked at Diana with exhausted eyes and said, "Is it worth it? And is peace worth this?" "Yes," Diana said, "and because if we give up now, then Ember got hurt for nothing, and all the people who have died in this war died for nothing, and we have to keep trying." The assassination attempt had an unexpected effect, because it made many Sylvan citizens realize how much they had come to care for their human princess, and protests erupted demanding better security and supporting the peace initiative. On the human side, Ambassador Rodriguez used the assassination attempt to argue that the Sylvan Empire was genuinely committed to peace, because why would they allow their heir to be in danger if this was just a political game? In the 5th month, Terran Command finally sent their formal response, and they were willing to proceed with peace negotiations, using Kayla as a mediator and representative of both peoples. The news arrived during breakfast, and Kayla read the message 3 times before she started laughing and crying at the same time. Queen Valara pulled her daughter into a tight embrace and said, "I am so proud of you, and you have done something I never thought possible." Diana hugged them both and felt tears streaming down her own face, because they had actually done it, and they had convinced 2 warring governments to try peace. The formal negotiations were scheduled to take place over 6 months and involve delegates from both sides, and Kayla would serve as the primary mediator, with support from both governments. Diana was appointed as one of the human delegates, which meant she could stay close to her sister throughout the process. The first negotiation session was tense and awkward, and both sides brought decades of grievances and mistrust to the table. But Kayla proved to be a natural mediator, and she had the unique ability to understand both perspectives and translate not just words but cultural context and emotional subtext. She would explain to the human delegates why a certain Sylvan custom was important, and she would help the Sylvan delegates understand human pragmatism and directness. Slowly, painfully, progress was made, and they agreed on a ceasefire, and then on prisoner exchanges, and then on trade agreements. There were setbacks and arguments and moments when it seemed like everything would fall apart. During one particularly difficult session, a human general accused the Sylvan Empire of using biological weapons in a border conflict, and the Sylvan delegates walked out in anger. Kayla found Diana afterward and said, "I do not know if I can do this, and they hate each other so much." Diana took her hands and said, "They do not hate each other, and they fear each other, and fear makes people do terrible things, but you are showing them there is another way." How? Kayla asked. "By existing," Diana said, "and every day you prove that humans and Sylvans cannot just coexist but thrive together. And you are the bridge, and bridges take time to build." Kayla went to each side separately and spent hours listening to their grievances and their fears and their hopes, and then she brought them back together with a proposal that addressed the core concerns of both sides. The negotiations continued, and by the 8th month they had drafted a preliminary peace treaty. It was not perfect, and both sides had to make compromises they did not like, but it was a start. The formal signing ceremony was held on the neutral moon, where they had held their first meeting, and delegates from dozens of worlds attended as witnesses. Kayla stood between Queen Valara and Ambassador Rodriguez, and her hands shook as she signed her name to the treaty. Diana watched from the audience and felt overwhelming pride, because her little sister, the girl who had been lost in space and raised by aliens, had just helped end a 30-year war. After the ceremony, there was a reception, and Diana found Kayla standing alone on a balcony with Spark and Ember beside her. "You did it," Diana said, and joined her sister. "We did it," Kayla corrected, "and I could not have done this without you." Diana put an arm around her shoulders and said, "So what happens now?" Kayla smiled and said, "Now the real work begins, and we have to make sure this peace actually holds, and we have to build trust and cooperation, and we have to prove that this was worth it." "Sounds exhausting," Diana said. "It will be," Kayla agreed, but I have you, and I have Queen Valara, and I have the dragons, and I think we can handle it." They stood together watching the stars, and Diana thought about the journey that had brought them here, and the colony ship that exploded, and the desperate evacuation, and the 15 years of grief, and the miraculous reunion. She thought about Queen Valara, who had chosen compassion over hatred and raised a human child as her own. She thought about the dragons who had bonded with a human and proved that some connections transcend species. And she thought about her sister, who had survived impossible odds and become a bridge between worlds. The future was uncertain, and there would be challenges and setbacks and people on both sides who would resist change. But for the first time in 30 years there was hope. And Diana decided that was enough. Kayla leaned her head on Diana's shoulder and said, "Thank you for finding me." Diana kissed her sister's hair and said, "Thank you for surviving." Spark and Ember made a harmonious sound that might have been approval or joy or simply contentment. And in that moment Diana felt at peace. The war was over, and her sister was alive, and together they had helped create something new. Two peoples who had been enemies were now learning to be allies, and it would take time and patience and probably more conflict. But they had proven it was possible, and sometimes that was all you needed. As the twin suns set over the neutral moon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Diana allowed herself to hope for a future where human children and sylvan children could grow up together, where dragons could fly freely without fear, and where families would not be torn apart by war. It was a beautiful dream, and for the first time in a very long time, Diana believed it might actually come true. Kayla looked up at her sister and said, "Do you think our parents would be proud?" Diana smiled through her tears and said, "They would be amazed, and you took something terrible and turned it into something beautiful. And you gave both our peoples a chance at peace, and yes, they would be incredibly proud. And so am I." Diana added, "And I'm so proud to be your sister." Kayla hugged her tightly, and they stood together under the alien stars with dragons at their side and hope in their hearts. The galaxy was changing, and they had been the catalysts, and whatever came next, they would face it together, because family was not just about blood, and it was about choice and love and standing beside each other when the whole universe seemed uncertain. And Diana and Kayla had chosen each other, and that choice had changed everything.